Look, I'm gonna be real with you about what happened because honestly, I'm tired of everyone acting like I'm some kind of monster. I'm Vivian, I'm 26, and yeah, I kissed my ex at my own engagement party. But before you judge me, you need to understand the whole story, because nobody else seems to want to hear my side. So here's the thing. I've been through enough crap in my life to know what I deserve, and what I deserve is someone who actually appreciates me. When I met Miles 2 years ago, I was still picking up the pieces from my relationship with Adrian, who basically destroyed my ability to trust anyone. Adrian cheated on me multiple times, made me feel like I wasn't good enough, and then had the nerve to act like it was somehow my fault for being too needy. So when Miles came along with his whole reformed bad boy thing, apologizing for his player past and trying so hard to prove he'd changed, I'll admit it felt good to have that kind of power for once. Miles was everything Adrian wasn't. He actually texted me back, remembered important dates, and seemed genuinely grateful just to be with me. Maybe that should have been a red flag, but after being treated like garbage for 2 years, having someone worship the ground I walked on felt pretty amazing. He was always asking if I was happy, if I needed anything, making sure I felt secure. Sometimes it was a little much, like when he'd get all insecure about his past and need constant reassurance that I wasn't going anywhere. But honestly, after Adrian's mind games, I preferred someone who was maybe too into me rather than not into me enough. The engagement happened pretty fast because Miles was so eager to lock it down. I think he was terrified someone else would come along and steal me away, which was flattering, even if it was kind of pathetic. When he proposed at that fancy restaurant downtown, going all out with the flowers and the photographer he secretly hired, I said yes, because why wouldn't I? Here was a guy who actually wanted to marry me, who saw a future with me, who wasn't going to waste my time playing games. And let's be honest, I was ready for the security that comes with being engaged. No more wondering where I stood, no more worrying about being alone. Planning the engagement party became this huge thing for me because I needed everyone to see that I'd won. My sister had been making these subtle comments about how I was settling for Miles because he wasn't as exciting as Adrian, and my friends kept asking if I was sure I wasn't moving too fast. It was like everyone was waiting for me to fail again, and I was determined to prove them wrong. This party was going to be perfect. The venue, the decorations, the guest list, everything. Miles kept worrying about the cost and asking if we really needed to invite so many people, but he just didn't understand how important this was. This wasn't just a party. It was proof that I could have the life I wanted. I spent weeks planning every detail, making sure everything would look amazing in photos. I wanted Adrian to see through our mutual friends exactly what he'd lost. I wanted my sister to eat her words about me settling. I wanted everyone who'd ever doubted me to see that I was the kind of woman who got the fairy tale ending. Miles thought I was being a little obsessive about it all, but that's because he didn't understand what it meant to have people constantly questioning your choices. He'd never had to prove himself the way I had to prove myself. The guest list was this careful balance of people I wanted to impress and people who actually mattered to me. I made sure to invite my college friends who'd always been Team Adrian, just so they could see how much better my life turned out. I invited my sister and her perfect husband so she could finally shut up about my relationship choices. And yeah, I made sure there would be enough people there that photos would look like I was this popular, beloved person with the perfect life. Miles didn't really get why the optics mattered so much, but he went along with it because that's what he did. Whatever made me happy. The week before the party, I was running around finalizing details and making sure everything would be flawless. I'd already picked out my outfit, this dress that made me look incredible and would photograph beautifully. I'd gotten my hair and nails done, and I was ready to show everyone that this was my moment. Miles was being supportive, helping where he could, but I could tell he was getting a little overwhelmed by how intense I was being about everything. He kept saying things like, "It's just a party," and "people will have fun regardless," which showed he really didn't understand what this meant to me. But I wasn't going to let his lack of vision ruin my perfect night. This party was going to be everything I'd dreamed of, and finally, everyone would see that I'd made the right choice. Finally, I'd get to be the girl who got everything she wanted instead of the girl who got her heart broken. Miles might not have understood the pressure I was under to make this perfect, but he'd thank me later when he saw how amazing everything turned out. This was going to be our night, and nothing was going to mess it up. A week before the party, Adrian slid into my DMs with this casual, saw the engagement pics, happy for you message, and honestly, my heart stopped for a second. I should have just ignored it, or maybe shown Miles, but there was something about seeing his name pop up that made me feel this weird rush of vindication. Like, finally, he was reaching out. Finally, he was acknowledging what he'd lost. So I wrote back something equally casual, just thanks. Hope you're doing well. But then he kept the conversation going. At first, it was totally innocent, him asking how I'd been, saying he'd heard good things about Miles through mutual friends, apologizing for how things ended between us. And you know what? It felt good to have him finally acknowledge that he'd messed up. For 2 years, I'd been waiting for some kind of apology or recognition that he'd treated me badly, and here it was. So when he said he regretted how he'd handled things, and that he'd done a lot of growing up since then, I found myself actually engaging with the conversation. Miles was at work during most of these text exchanges, and when he'd come home asking about my day, I'd tell him about everything else, but somehow forget to mention that Adrian had reached out. It wasn't like I was hiding anything major. We were just talking like adults, being mature about our past. Miles had always been a little insecure about Adrian anyway, probably because he knew Adrian was more exciting, more spontaneous, the kind of guy who could sweep you off your feet. If I told him we were texting, he'd probably make it weird and ask me to stop. And honestly, I was enjoying having this little secret. The conversation started getting longer, with Adrian reminiscing about good times we'd had together, places we'd gone, inside jokes we used to share. He kept saying things like, "I know I messed up the best thing that ever happened to me, and seeing you happy makes me realize what an idiot I was." Part of me knew he was probably just being nostalgic or maybe even trying to stir up drama, but another part of me was eating it up. This was the Adrian I'd fallen in love with originally. Charming, attentive, making me feel like I was the only woman in the world. When he asked if he could come to the engagement party to properly congratulate me and meet the guy who was smart enough to lock me down, I knew I should say no. But the idea of him seeing my happiness, seeing how much Miles adored me, seeing what he'd lost, it felt too good to pass up. Plus, wouldn't it show how mature and confident I was that I could invite my ex to my engagement party? Wouldn't it prove that I was totally over him and secure in my relationship? I told Miles that someone from my old job wanted to bring a +1, keeping it deliberately vague. Miles just said sure, the more the merrier, because that's how he was. Trusting, accommodating, never questioning my decisions. Sometimes his complete faith in me was touching, and sometimes it was almost disappointing how easy it was to get things past him. Adrian had always been suspicious and jealous, constantly checking up on me, which was exhausting but also kind of exciting. Miles's trust felt safe, but also a little boring. The night before the party, Adrian texted that he was looking forward to seeing me tomorrow, and that he hoped Miles knew how lucky he was. I found myself staring at that text longer than I should have, feeling this dangerous little thrill. Tomorrow night, I'd have everything I wanted. The perfect party, the perfect fiancé worshipping me, and my ex seeing exactly what he'd given up. It was going to be the ultimate victory lap. The engagement party was everything I dreamed it would be and more. I looked absolutely incredible in my dress, Miles was being the perfect doting fiancé, and everyone kept telling me how radiant I looked, and how lucky I was. The venue looked amazing, the food was perfect, and I was already getting great photos for social media. This was my moment, and I was savoring every second of it. When Adrian walked in, I felt this little jolt of electricity that I hadn't expected. He looked really good, confident, put together, like he'd been taking care of himself. When he came over to congratulate Miles and me, there was this energy between us that reminded me why I'd fallen for him in the first place. Miles was being his usual friendly, trusting self, shaking Adrian's hand and thanking him for coming, completely oblivious to any undercurrent. Throughout the night, I found myself gravitating toward Adrian more than I probably should have. I was showing him around the venue, introducing him to people, making sure he felt included. It felt natural, like we were still connected in some way that Miles and I weren't. When people asked how we knew each other, I'd just say, old friends, and Adrian would smile in this way that made me remember all the good times we'd had before everything went wrong. Miles was busy playing host, making sure everyone's drinks were full, checking that the catering was going smoothly, being his typical considerate self. But honestly, I was starting to feel a little ignored. This was supposed to be my night, our night, and he was spending more time making sure everyone else was having fun than paying attention to me. When I tried to pull him aside for photos or just to talk, he'd say, "Just give me 5 minutes to check on the cake." Or "Let me make sure your aunt has everything she needs." It was sweet, but also frustrating. Adrian, on the other hand, was giving me his full attention. He kept complimenting how I looked, asking about my life, really listening when I talked. When I mentioned feeling a little overwhelmed by all the people and attention, he suggested we step outside for some air because it was getting crowded inside. It seemed innocent enough. Just two old friends catching up away from the noise. Behind the venue, where it was quieter and cooler, Adrian told me I looked absolutely beautiful, and that seeing me so happy made him realize what an incredible mistake he'd made letting me go. We were standing closer than we probably should have been, but it felt so natural, so right. He was saying all the things I'd wanted to hear for years. How stupid he'd been, how he'd never stopped thinking about me, how he'd never found anyone who understood him the way I did. The conversation got really intense really fast. He was telling me about how he'd changed, how losing me had made him realize what really mattered, how he'd been hoping for a chance to make things right between us. When he reached out to touch my face and said, "I never should have let you go," I should have stepped back. I should have reminded him that I was engaged, that I was happy, that this was inappropriate. But in that moment, standing there with him looking at me like I was everything he'd ever wanted, I felt more alive than I had in months. When he leaned in to kiss me, I didn't stop him. For those few minutes, I felt like the old version of myself. Desired, chosen, electric, in a way I hadn't felt since we'd been together. It was like all the hurt and anger from our breakup just melted away, and we were back to being Adrian and Vivian, the couple everyone said was meant to be together before it all fell apart. Miles's voice cutting through the moment was like getting hit with ice water. The look on his face when he saw us was something I'll never be able to forget. Not angry or furious like I expected, but just completely broken. Like someone had reached into his chest and ripped his heart out right in front of him. Adrian immediately started apologizing, saying it was all his fault, that he'd initiated everything, but Miles wasn't even looking at him. His eyes were locked on me, and I could see him trying to process what he was witnessing. I started explaining, trying to tell him it wasn't what it looked like, that it had just happened, that it didn't mean anything. But even as the words were coming out of my mouth, they sounded hollow and stupid. Miles didn't yell or make a scene or do any of the dramatic things I might have expected. He just looked at Adrian and said very quietly, "I need you to leave. Now." His voice was so calm it was almost scary. Adrian tried to apologize again, but Miles held up his hand and said, "Just go," in this tone that made it clear he wasn't going to ask twice. After Adrian left, Miles looked at me for what felt like forever before walking back toward the venue. I followed him, trying to grab his arm, trying to get him to talk to me, but he just gently pulled away without saying anything. Inside, Miles quietly started telling people that someone had gotten sick and we needed to wrap up the party early. He was so calm and polite about it that most people just assumed it was some kind of family emergency and started gathering their things. I stood there watching our perfect night crumble, watching all my carefully planned celebration fall apart, and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. When it was just us and the cleanup crew, Miles finally spoke to me again. He didn't ask how long it had been going on, or why I'd done it, or any of the questions I was expecting. He just said he was going to stay at his friend's place that night, and we'd talk in the morning when we'd both had time to process what happened. I wanted to explain, to make him understand that it had just been a moment of weakness, that Adrian had caught me off guard, that I loved Miles and wanted to marry him. But something about his calm devastation made me feel defensive instead of sorry. I found myself saying things like, "It was just a kiss," and "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," and "Maybe if you'd been paying attention to me instead of playing host all night, this wouldn't have happened." The words just poured out before I could stop them, and I watched something change in his eyes. Not anger, but something worse, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time and didn't like what he was looking at. The next morning, Miles came back to the apartment, but not to reconcile like I'd hoped. He came back to get his things, and he'd already made decisions that I wasn't prepared for. Before I could even start my prepared speech about how we could work through this, he cut me off by showing me his phone. He'd already called the wedding venue, the caterer, the photographer, the florist. Everything was canceled. The wedding that we'd been planning for months was just gone, like it had never existed. I was completely shocked by how quickly he was moving, how final everything felt. When I protested that we could work through this, that couples overcome worse things than one stupid kiss, he told me something that made my stomach drop. He'd found all the text messages between Adrian and me on my laptop, which I'd left open the night before. Seeing months of flirting and emotional cheating laid out like that made me feel cornered and angry rather than sorry. I went on the attack, telling him he had no right to go through my private messages, that he was violating my privacy, that this whole thing was an overreaction to what was basically nothing. But Miles just stood there taking it, which made me even angrier. I needed him to fight back, to get emotional, to give me something to work with. His calm acceptance of the end of our relationship felt like the ultimate rejection. I found myself saying cruel things that I knew would hurt him. I told him that maybe I kissed Adrian because I missed feeling desired by someone who didn't worship the ground I walked on. I said his desperation to prove he'd changed from his player days had made him boring and predictable. I said Adrian made me feel alive in ways that Miles never could. The words just kept coming, and I watched something die in his eyes with each one. Miles listened to everything I said without defending himself or fighting back. When I was done, he just told me he was going to stay with his friend indefinitely, and that I had 30 days to figure out new living arrangements since the lease was in his name. He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather, instead of ending our entire life together. As he loaded his car with his belongings, neighbors were watching from their windows, and I felt humiliated by the spectacle of it all. This was supposed to be the weekend everyone was congratulating us on our engagement, and instead, I was standing in the driveway watching my fiancé leave me. When my sister called, having heard through mutual friends that the engagement was off, I expected sympathy but got a lecture about throwing away the best thing that ever happened to me. Everyone seemed to think this was my fault, like I was the villain in this story. 3 months later, my life has completely fallen apart in ways I never could have predicted. The worst part is that none of it feels fair or proportional to what actually happened. I mean, it was one kiss with an ex-boyfriend. People have survived worse betrayals and managed to work things out. But Miles acted like I'd committed some unforgivable sin instead of just having a moment of weakness. I had to move back in with my parents because I couldn't afford the apartment on my own, which has been absolutely humiliating at 26. My mom keeps making these passive-aggressive comments about making better choices, and my dad barely talks to me. Living in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by posters and trophies from high school, feels like the ultimate failure. Every day I wake up in that house is a reminder that my life went backwards instead of forwards. Adrian, who I thought might actually want something real after everything that happened at the party, completely ghosted me once Miles was out of the picture. Apparently, the thrill was only in the chase and the conquest, not in actually being with me. He got what he wanted. He broke up my engagement and proved he could still have me if he wanted to. And then he disappeared. It's like he was just playing some sick game and I was too stupid to see it. My friend group, which was largely connected through Miles and his social circle, has essentially iced me out. They're not openly hostile or anything, but the invitations stopped coming, and I see their hangouts on social media without me. When I run into them at the grocery store or whatever, they're polite but distant, like I'm someone they used to know instead of someone they were planning to have in their wedding parties. Miles, meanwhile, seems to be absolutely thriving in ways that make me physically sick. Through mutual acquaintances, I hear updates about his life that feel like daggers to my heart. He got a promotion at work, started going to therapy, joined some kind of hiking group, and apparently he's dating someone new. A teacher, from what I heard, who treats him well and doesn't play games. The worst part is seeing how happy he looks in photos that people show me. Like he's genuinely better off without me. When I found out that Miles and his new girlfriend got engaged after only 8 months together, I honestly thought I was going to throw up. 8 months, and he gave her a ring that's twice the size of what he gave me. 8 months, and he's ready to commit to forever with someone else. It took him 3 years to propose to me, and now suddenly he's rushing to the altar with some random teacher he barely knows. Everyone keeps acting like I'm the bad guy in this story, like I'm some kind of monster who destroyed a perfect relationship for no reason. But they don't understand what it was like being with someone who loved me more than I loved him. They don't understand the pressure of being put on a pedestal all the time, of having someone's entire happiness depend on your mood. Miles was suffocating in his devotion, and maybe subconsciously I needed to do something to break free of that. At my cousin's wedding last month, I overheard my aunt telling someone that Miles dodged a bullet with that one, and I realized that even my own family thinks I'm the problem. Everyone has decided that I'm this selfish, heartless person who threw away true love for a meaningless fling. But they weren't in my relationship. They don't know what it was really like. The truth is, I'm not sorry for what I did. I'm sorry it all went so wrong, and I'm bitter that everyone took his side without even trying to understand mine. Relationships are complicated, and sometimes you need to follow your heart, even when it leads you somewhere messy. Maybe Miles never really loved me anyway. Maybe he just loved the idea of me, or the security of having someone who made him feel better about his past. Maybe this was all just an excuse for him to find someone who fit better into his boring, predictable life. I refuse to believe that I'm the villain here. I made one mistake, had one moment of weakness, and somehow that makes me irredeemable? Meanwhile, Miles gets to ride off into the sunset with his perfect new girlfriend, while I'm stuck living with my parents and being treated like a social pariah. If that's not proof that life isn't fair, I don't know what is.